we were talking about Jacob, and I'll re-update his biography a little bit so that we can place ourselves in the proper context before we go on. So his mother, Rebecca, gave birth to twins, and the twins, even in her womb, were struggling for, well, they were struggling, and of course the story is that they were struggling for dominance, the older, or the younger against the older, really, because Jacob means usurper, and Rebecca had a vision from God that said that Jacob would supplant Esau. And so even before her twins were born, they were in a state of competition. And that's a recapitulation of the motif of the hostile brothers, right? It's a very, very, very common mythological motif. And we already saw that really well developed in the story of Cain and Abel, right? And Cain and Abel were essentially the first two human beings, the first two natural-born human beings, and they were instantly locked in a state of enmity, which is symbolic of, first, the enmity that exists within people's psyche, between the part of them, you might say, that's aiming at the light and the part of them that's aiming at the darkness. And I think that's a reasonable way of portraying it. Obviously, it's a way that's sort of rife with symbolism, but my experience of people, especially when you get to know them seriously or when they're dealing with serious issues, is that there is quite clearly a part of them that's striving to do well in the world or even to do good, and another part that's deeply cynical and embittered that says to hell with it and is self-destructive and lashes out and really aims at making things worse. And so that seems to be a natural part of the human psyche, and that's also reflected in the idea of the fall. And so those ideas are not easily cast away. They're associated with the rise of self-consciousness, right, in the story of the Garden of Eden. And I think that's right, because I do think that our self-consciousness produces that division within us, because more than any other creature, we're intensely aware of our finitude and suffering, and that tends to turn us, at least to some degree, against being itself. You know, I was watching a bunch of protesters in the U.S. last week scream at the sky about Trump, you know, and it was interesting. Like, I thought it was an extraordinarily narcissistic display, but despite that, there was something symbolically appropriate about it. There's a movie I really like, sadly enough, called Fubar. I don't know how many of you have seen that. Yeah, you know that movie, I take it. Yeah, it's about the people I grew up with. So, yeah, that's true, man. I'm telling you, that's true. So the guy, the main actor in Fubar, who's quite bright but completely uncivilized, gets testicular cancer, and there's one great scene where he gets far too drunk and he's stumbling around the street, you know, in a virtually comatose state. And of course, he's not very thrilled with what's happened to him, and he's shaking his fist at the sky. It's pouring rain, and he's cursing God. And, you know, it's like, well, you can kind of understand his position. So that kind of reminded me of these people who were yelling at the sky. You know, they were dramatizing the idea of they were enraged at, well, you could say God. Of course, most of them wouldn't say that, but they were the ones yelling at the damn sky. I mean, you know, so you gotta look at what they're doing rather than what they say. And they were outraged that being was constructed such that Trump could have arisen as president. And so this idea, you know, that we can be easily turned against being and work for its destruction is a really common theme. It never goes away. You see it echoed in stories like with the new Marvel series, for example. You see the enmity between Thor and Loki. That's a good example of the same thing. Or between Batman and the Joker. Or Superman and Lex Luthor. There's these pairs of hero against villain. That's a really dramatic and easily what everyone can understand that dynamic, right? It's a basic plot. And the reason it's a basic plot is because it's true of the battle within our spirits, our own individual spirits. It's true within families, because sibling rivalry can be unbelievably brutal. It's true between human beings who are strangers. It's true between groups of people. Like, it's true at every level of analysis. And then, in some sense, it's archetypally true, at least with regards to deep religious symbolism, because you see that echoed in many stories as well. So I think the clearest representation is probably Christ and Satan. That's the closest to a pure archetype. Although there's, in the old Egyptian stories, there's Osiris and Seth, or Horus and Seth is a precursor to Satan etymologically. So it's a very, very common motif, and so that's what happens again in Rebecca's womb, is that this idea is played out right away. And the two twins are actually, what would you call it there? They have a superordinate destiny, because one of them is destined to become the father of Israel. And of course that's a pinnacle moment in the Old Testament, obviously, and arguably a pinnacle moment in human history. Now,